Pull a dark frame out of a strong colony sometime and watch yourself. The colony is working. The brood pattern is solid. The bees are calm. The weight of the frame tells you something is being stored correctly. But the comb is dark, coffee brown, almost black in the corners where the cells run deepest, where the wall thickness has built up over years of use. And somewhere in the back of your mind, the advice kicks in. The advice you've absorbed across years of reading, of club meetings, of extension pamphlets and online forums and well-meaning recommendations from people who were repeating what they'd been told. Replace it. 3 years, some say. 5 at the outside. Old comb is a liability. Dark comb is old comb. Get it out of the hive before it becomes a problem. That advice has been repeated so many times across so many channels that most beekeepers have stopped asking where it came from. It feels like settled wisdom. It has the texture of something measured and proven and passed down from people who knew better. It isn't. And the reason it isn't is something Moses Quinby understood in 1860, and that the biology of comb still confirms today if you know what to look at. The most frequently cited reason to replace old comb has nothing to do with comb biology. It comes from somewhere else entirely. And once that source is clear, the color of a frame stops being a useful measurement of anything. That story takes a few minutes to trace properly because the confusion has been building for a long time and it arrived gradually, through a sequence of events that each made sense in isolation. The sequence, taken together, does not hold up. If you've ever retired a frame based on color alone and the colony it came from was working fine, leave that in the comments below. That number might mean something by the end of this. Quinby managed bees commercially in upstate New York across the middle decades of the 19th century, and he wrote down what he observed. Not theories carried in from other fields, not assumptions about what ought to be true given how comb looked. What he actually saw in his hives across years and years of working the same equipment through the same seasonal cycles. He kept comb in productive service well beyond what modern recommendations would permit, 8 years in some documented cases, more in others, and he did not treat this as a calculated risk or a compromise. He treated it as a practical observation about what the colony actually required from him and what it did not. The comb that the colony accepted and worked in, that produced healthy brood and stored honey efficiently and held its structure through the weight of a productive flow, was comb that did not need his intervention. He left it alone. Quinby was not being careless with his equipment. He was being precise in a way that most beekeepers today have stopped being. He was reading the colony's relationship to its own comb rather than reading the comb's color and making assumptions about what that color meant biologically. Most beekeepers walk right past what Quinby understood. Every single inspection, frame after frame, the signal is there and the question isn't being asked. To understand why the color question has been so thoroughly misread, it is necessary to understand what actually happens to comb over time. Not what it looks like from the outside, but what is physically occurring inside the cell walls across successive brood cycles, season after season, colony after colony. When a worker bee emerges from her cell, she leaves behind a thin layer of material. Silk from the cocoon she spun during her pupal development, propolis residue from the cell's interior surface, a contribution of larval frass and shed exoskeleton. This layer is thin, a fraction of a millimeter per cycle, but it accumulates. Each brood cycle adds to it. The cell walls thicken gradually, the interior diameter narrows by a modest amount. The color shifts from the pale gold of freshly drawn comb through amber and warm brown toward the deep, nearly black tones that most beekeepers associate with worn-out equipment. This process is commonly described as contamination. It is not contamination. It is documentation. Every layer of darkened cocoon material in an old frame is the biological record of every colony that developed inside it. The bees do not experience this accumulation as degradation. Between brood cycles, house bees clean the cells with precision, removing loose material, applying propolis to the interior walls, preparing the surface for the next occupant. The queen, offered genuine choice between new comb and old comb in a functioning brood nest, does not consistently prefer the new. Old comb retains heat differently than fresh foundation. The surface texture that emerges from repeated cleaning and cocoon layering is one the colony works with rather than around. It is familiar in a way that carries meaning for the colony's thermal and chemical environment. The bees are not tolerating dark comb. They are using it because it serves them. The darkening is not deterioration. Every layer that makes a frame look old is also the record of every colony that lived well inside it. A.I. Root, writing in the early editions of the ABC and XYZ of bee culture, described old comb with the same practical acceptance that Quinby demonstrated. The concern in that tradition was structural integrity, whether the comb held its shape under the weight of a honey crop and the pressure of a summer cluster, not color. C.C. Miller, who managed bees productively into the early 20th century and documented his practices with the same empirical discipline, did not treat comb color as a management variable worth acting on. These were men who worked colonies for decades and wrote down what they actually observed. They were not cavalier about their equipment. They were precise about what actually required attention, and color did not make that list. The question then becomes specific. If Quinby and Root and Miller were not retiring comb on a color or age schedule, and if the biology of cocoon layering produces nothing that justifies it, what is the actual origin of the recommendation that most contemporary beekeepers treat as settled wisdom? The answer has a date and a cause. It did not exist before that date in the form most beekeepers recognize today. When Varroa destructor arrived in North American beekeeping in the late 1980s, it arrived without an effective non-chemical response available at scale. Commercial operations and serious hobbyists alike reached for the tools that were available. Apistan, carrying tau fluvalinate as its active compound, became the standard response. Coumaphos followed. These compounds controlled mite populations well enough to keep colonies alive through seasons that would otherwise have destroyed them, and they were used heavily, repeatedly, across multiple treatment cycles per year. Both tau fluvalinate and coumaphos share a chemical property that would, over the following decade, generate a significant and legitimate body of research. They are lipophilic, they bind readily to fats and waxes, and beeswax is by its chemical nature predominantly lipid. The miticide compounds applied to comb surfaces in the brood nest did not simply perform their function and disappear. They partitioned into the wax. Each treatment cycle contributed to an accumulating residue load. Research published from the late 1990s onward documented this accumulation in careful detail. Comb from heavily treated operations carried measurable concentrations of these compounds in the wax itself. Concentrations that increased with each successive treatment cycle, concentrations that persisted after the visible treatment strips were removed, concentrations that created a legitimate concern about their effects on developing brood and on the bees working within those cells. This was a real problem. The research that documented it was sound. The concern it generated about old comb in operations depending on synthetic miticide treatments was biologically legitimate and practically important. Here is where the story turns. Here is where the recommendation and the biology parted ways, quietly, in the space between careful research and general advice. The research on miticide accumulation in beeswax was conducted primarily in the context of operations using synthetic treatments repeatedly over years. The comb carrying the highest residue loads was in those operations old comb, not because age itself created the problem, but because age in that specific context meant more treatment cycles, and more treatment cycles meant more residue accumulation. The variable that actually mattered in that research was chemical history. Age was a proxy for it, an imperfect one, applicable only within operations where synthetic compounds had been applied repeatedly, but a proxy that was practically useful in that specific context. When the recommendation to replace old comb on a fixed schedule entered mainstream beekeeping literature and extension advice, it did not always carry that distinction with it. The nuance, that the concern was chemical accumulation specific to repeated synthetic miticide use, not comb aging as a biological process, frequently disappeared in transmission. The detail that mattered most about the research got simplified away. What the beekeeper heard at the club meeting, what the extension pamphlet summarized in a paragraph, what the popular advice repeated across decades of beekeeping publications, was simpler and cleaner and more actionable. Old comb is a problem. Dark comb is old comb. Replace dark comb on a schedule. Old comb and contaminated comb are not the same thing. The industry treated them as if they were, and the recommendation followed the confusion. That conflation, age and chemical history collapsed into a single visual proxy, is the origin of the 3-year rule. It is not fraudulent. It emerged from real research into a real problem, but in transmission from the specific context where it applied to the general recommendation that followed, the context itself was lost, and what remained was a rule applied universally to all dark comb, regardless of management history, in operations that had never used a synthetic miticide and in operations that had been treating heavily for decades. The same color, the same recommendation, two entirely different biological situations. A dark frame from a colony that has never received a synthetic miticide treatment. A naturally managed operation, an organic operation, a beekeeper relying on brood breaks and oxalic acid and mechanical controls since Varroa arrived, is biologically different from a dark frame pulled from a colony treated repeatedly with synthetic compounds over many seasons. Both are dark. The cocoon layering process doesn't register the difference between a chemical-free environment and a heavily treated one. The color is the same. The residue load is not. A dark frame with no synthetic miticide history is, from a comb biology standpoint, exactly what Quinby was working with. Clean wax carrying a structural record of productive brood cycles. Nothing more, nothing less. A dark frame from a long-treated operation is a different object. Same appearance, different chemical history, different biological concern. The recommendation to rotate it out is grounded in real science. But applying that recommendation universally, to all dark comb regardless of management history, treats color as a proxy for contamination when color is actually a proxy for age. These are not the same variable. They have never been the same variable. And the assumption that they are has been costing beekeepers drawn comb they did not need to lose for 30 years. The practical question then is not how old the comb is, not how dark. The question is what has been in it and whether the structure and condition of what's physically present meets the actual criteria for retirement. Those criteria look nothing like color. If this kind of biology-first approach to equipment decisions is the kind of thinking that changes how you manage, subscribing means there is more of this coming. Historical method, biological mechanism, practical criteria, the kind that works without a supply catalog. The first criterion is structural. Comb that has lost its capacity to hold shape, that sags between top and bottom bars under the weight of a honey crop, that shows visible warping or gross irregularity in its surface geometry, has reached the end of its functional life regardless of color. This was the failure mode that Quinby and Root were watching for. Not hue, the physical capacity to function under load. The second criterion is contamination from specific brood diseases. American foul brood spores are extraordinarily persistent, viable in old comb for decades under the right conditions. Comb associated with a confirmed AFB outbreak is not a comb retirement decision. It is a destruction decision, and it has been understood as such by commercial beekeepers since the early 20th century. No amount of cleaning restores comb that has carried active AFB. This criterion predates the miticide conversation by 50 years. The third, and most relevant to contemporary operations with a chemical management history, is verified residue accumulation in operations where synthetic miticides have been applied repeatedly over years. If a beekeeper has treated with synthetic compounds across multiple seasons and has reason to believe residue accumulation has reached levels that could affect brood development or colony health, comb rotation is a legitimate and reasoned response. But it is a response to a specific documented condition in a specific management history, not a response to a color. The fourth criterion is physical deformation of cell geometry from heat damage, crushing, or structural failure caused by something other than age. Comb that has been melted by hive heat in a hot summer, or collapsed by mishandling, may present cells that queens avoid or that cannot support normal development. This is visible not as color but as geometry, irregular, distorted, collapsed cell structure that the eye reads differently than normal darkened comb. Color is not a retirement criterion. Drawn comb is the most valuable physical asset in a working apiary. The colony spent energy, significant energy, drawn from nectar the foragers collected and the workers processed to build it. The queen has accepted it and laid through it across multiple seasons, reading cell surfaces and dimensions and conditions that her behavior reflects but that human inspection alone cannot fully interpret. The house bees have cleaned and maintained it and built their thermal and chemical environment around it cycle after cycle. Retiring it because its color tells a story about brood cycles completed, rather than because its structure, its chemical history, or its biological condition actually warrants action, is a loss that compounds quietly across years of unnecessary equipment turnover. There is something worth slowing down for here. When an experienced beekeeper pulls a dark frame from a colony that is working well and decides it is time to retire it based on color alone, they are not making a neutral equipment decision. They are discarding something the colony built and maintained and adapted to across years of active use. The cells in that frame hold a biological history, layers of cocoon silk from thousands of bees who developed inside them, propolis applied by house bees who kept the surface between each cycle, wax contributed and reworked and maintained by a colony that found the frame worth maintaining. That frame is not worn out, it is experienced. There is a difference, and the colony knows it even if the beekeeper has stopped looking for it. Quinby read the colony's relationship to its comb and trusted what the colony showed him. The recommendation most modern beekeepers have absorbed asks them to override that relationship based on a visual measurement that doesn't track the problem it's supposed to represent. The bees have been giving the right signal. The question has always been whether the beekeeper was looking at the right thing. The biology of comb hasn't changed since Quinby worked his hives in the 1860s. Cocoon layers still accumulate at the same rate, cell walls still thicken through the same mechanism, queens still respond to cell architecture and surface condition rather than to color. And a comb from a chemical-free operation that has been in productive service for 8 or 10 years is biologically indistinguishable from one that is 2 years old, except in the story its color tells. A story about brood cycles completed, not about damage sustained. What changed is the chemical context of modern beekeeping. That context made comb rotation genuinely necessary in specific operations under specific management conditions. The research that documented it was sound. The recommendation that followed was reasonable within its original context. But when the context was stripped from the recommendation, and color became the universal proxy for a problem that color doesn't actually measure, something important got lost, and what replaced it was a rule that cost beekeepers drawn comb they didn't need to lose and trust in equipment they didn't need to abandon. Quinby's criterion and the biology of comb still agree on this. Pull the frame when the structure fails. Pull it when the disease history demands it. Pull it when the chemical load in a treated operation warrants rotation based on management history, not visual appearance. Do not pull it because the color tells you how many seasons of productive brood it has housed. That is the wrong question. It has always been the wrong question. What does your oldest working frame look like? And the last time you pulled it, was it the comb that told you something was wrong, the structure, the geometry, something the colony was showing you, or was it the color? If this kind of historically grounded precision changes how you think about what deserves to stay in the hive, subscribe. There is more forgotten biology ahead, the kind that has been sitting in the historical record, waiting for someone to ask the right question of it.